On the morning of her 18th birthday, Marin Holloway received two things. The first was silence. No card on the kitchen table. No candles. No one calling her name from down the hall, the way her father used to low and warm, like he had all the time in the world. The second was an envelope. Gloria stood in the doorway of the only home Marin had ever known. Arms crossed, eyes aimed somewhere just past Marin's left shoulder, as if the girl standing in front of her had already ceased to exist. "Your father left this for you," she said. "Don't ever say I wasn't fair." The door closed. The deadbolt drove home with a sound like a period at the end of a very long sentence. Marin stood on the porch in the cold March air, the envelope in her hand. Inside, she could feel the rigid shape of an old iron key and a folded document. She didn't cry. She didn't rage. She simply looked down at that thin envelope and understood with a clarity that surprised even her that everything that came next, every hard thing, every impossible choice was going to be entirely up to her. She was 18 years old. She was alone. And somewhere in the mountains of West Virginia, an abandoned mill was waiting. She just didn't know yet that her father had been waiting too. On the morning of her 18th birthday, Marin Holloway received two things. The first was silence. No card on the kitchen table. No candles pressed into a stack of pancakes the way her father used to do, one for each year, always slightly lopsided, because he could never get the wax to stay straight. No voice calling her name from down the hall, that low, unhurried voice that made everything feel like there was still time, like there would always be more time. The second thing was an envelope. Gloria Marsh stood in the doorway of the only home Marin had ever known. She was dressed already fully composed at 7 in the morning, her dark hair pinned back, her expression arranged into something that was not quite coldness and not quite indifference, but lived precisely in the narrow space between the two. Her arms were crossed. Her eyes were aimed at a point just past Marin's left shoulder, as if the girl standing in front of her had already been subtracted from the room. She held out the envelope without ceremony. "Your father left this for you," she said. "Don't ever say I wasn't fair." Marin took it. The paper was Manila standard weight, slightly warm from being held. Through it, she could feel the hard outline of a key and the folded edge of a document. That was all. No thickness to suggest anything more. No weight to suggest a future. Gloria stepped back. The door swung shut. The deadbolt drove home with a sound like a period placed at the end of a very long sentence. Final, deliberate, irrevocable. Marin stood on the porch in the gray March air and did not move for a long moment. The cold came in through the thin fabric of her hoodie, the particular kind of cold that doesn't punish you. It simply ignores you the way a river ignores a stone lying on its bank. It moves around you without acknowledgement, without malice, without any feeling at all. She looked down at the envelope. She didn't cry. She was surprised to discover she had no tears ready. No grief surging upward the way she had expected it might on this particular morning. What she had instead was something quieter and in some ways more frightening. A clarity, the same sensation she sometimes got at the top of a very long staircase, looking down that precise awareness of exactly how far there was to fall. She understood standing on that porch with a cardboard box at her feet and a stranger's key in her hand, that everything that came next was going to be entirely up to her. She picked up the box. She walked to the curb. She did not look back at the house. She was 18 years old. She had $40 in her pocket, a laptop in her backpack, a shoebox of photographs, and an envelope containing a mystery she didn't yet know how to read. She flagged down the bus at the corner of Birch and Raleigh, the same corner where her father used to wait with her on the first day of every school year, always 5 minutes early. Always with 2 cups of coffee in a paper bag, one for him, one for her, even when she was too young for coffee, even when it was mostly milk. She got on the bus. She paid her fare. She found a window seat and pressed her forehead against the cool glass and watched the neighborhood scroll past like the opening credits of a film she hadn't agreed to be in. It was the last time she would see those streets for a long while. She just didn't know yet how much she would change before she saw them again. The law office of Harlan Pruitt occupied the second floor of a narrow brick building on the corner of Merchant Street in downtown Harwick, Virginia. The building was old enough to have its own personality, slightly crooked, slightly worn at the edges, but solid in the way that old things sometimes are, having already survived everything the world thought to throw at them. The stairs creaked on the way up. The waiting room smelled of wood polish and old paper and faintly of the pipe tobacco that Pruitt no longer smoked, but had smoked for 30 years, long enough that the smell had become part of the building's permanent record. Marin had been here once before on the day of her father's will reading 8 months ago. She had sat in this same chair with Gloria on one side of her, and the weight of grief on the other, and she had listened to the careful, measured language of legal documents being read aloud, and she had understood almost none of it. She had been too raw then, too newly emptied, to process much beyond the basic fact of absence. Today, she was not raw. Today, she was something harder than raw. She was waiting. Harlan Pruitt appeared in the doorway of his inner office and looked at her with an expression she recognized, the careful, compassionate look of a man preparing to deliver news he wishes were different. He was 67 years old, lean in the way of a man who has always been lean, with close-cropped gray hair and eyes that were steady and dark, and had seen enough of the world's business to be surprised by very little of it. He had been her father's lawyer for 22 years. More than that, he had been her father's friend. The kind of quiet, constant friend that men of a certain generation rarely speak about directly, but would do anything to keep. "Marin," he said, "come in, please." She sat across from his desk. The desk was enormous dark oak covered in the organized archaeology of an active legal practice. Stacked folders, yellow legal pads, a mug that said, "World's okayest lawyer," that someone had clearly given him as a joke, and that he clearly used every single day. She placed the manila envelope on the desk between them. He looked at it for a moment before picking it up. He slid out the contents with the practiced care of a man who handled important papers the way a surgeon handles instruments deliberately, with full attention to what he was doing. A folded deed, a set of transfer documents bearing the seal of the county recorder's office, and an iron key, old-fashioned and heavy its bow, shaped in the unmistakable outline of a crow in flight. "The Ashford Mill," he said. "She said it was my inheritance." Marin kept her voice level. She seemed pleased about it. Pruitt set the documents down slowly. He laced his fingers together on the desk and looked at her with an expression that had shifted slightly away from compassion and towards something more complicated. Something that had both sorrow and anger in it, carefully balanced. "The Ashford Mill," he said again, as if weighing the words. "Your grandfather built it in 1971. Your father ran it until 2012, when the economics of small independent lumber operations made it impossible to continue. He shut it down when you were 6 years old and moved the family to Harwick." He paused. "He never sold it. A lot of people told him to. He never would." "Why?" "Because it was his father's. Because it was yours in his mind even then. He always said he was keeping it for you." Pruitt's jaw tightened slightly, almost imperceptibly. What he did not anticipate, or perhaps did not anticipate fully, was the tax situation. He slid a separate document across the desk. It was a county notice, official and impersonal, printed on government letterhead. Marin read the number at the bottom. $43,800. "Back taxes," Pruitt said. 12 years of them accumulating at penalty rates. Your father maintained the payments for a time, but in his final years, when the illness made working impossible, the payments lapsed. He met her eyes directly because he was the kind of man who did that. "Technically speaking, Marin, what Gloria has given you is not an inheritance. It is a liability, a debt attached to a condemned property in a county where you have no resources and no support." The room was very quiet. Marin looked at the iron key on the desk, the crow in flight. She thought about Gloria's face in the doorway, that precise arrangement of expression that was satisfaction wearing the costume of neutrality. She knew, Marin said. It was not a question. She knew, Pruitt confirmed. And the mill. What happens if I can't pay the taxes? The county seizes the property, at which point it becomes available for acquisition by any interested party willing to pay the outstanding debt and take on the liability. He paused. There is, I should tell you, an interested party. Marsh Capital. They have made inquiries about the property before lowball offers mostly dismissed when your father was alive. But with him gone, and with the property now in the hands of a newly 18-year-old with no means. Callum Marsh, Marin said. The name tasted like something she needed to spit out. Pruitt nodded once. Gloria's brother. Marin was quiet for a moment. She looked at her hands in her lap. She thought about the way the deadbolt had sounded when it drove home that final deliberate sound. She thought about what it meant to design something to fail, to wrap a trap in the language of generosity. I want to see it, she said. Pruitt looked at her steadily. Marin, the property has been condemned. The main structure is not safe. There is nothing there. My father kept it for 12 years, she said. He kept paying taxes on it for as long as he physically could. He never sold it even when people told him to, even when it would have made his life easier. She picked up the iron key. The metal was cold and heavier than she expected. He kept it for a reason. I need to know what that reason was. Pruitt studied her for a long moment. Then he reached into his desk drawer and took out his personal checkbook and wrote a check for $300 and pushed it across the desk toward her. Bus fare, he said. And food. Don't argue with me about it. He closed the checkbook. Your father would have wanted it. She looked at the check. Shame and gratitude arrived at exactly the same time as they often do. She took it. Be careful, Pruitt said as she stood. And Marin, call me when you get there. Whatever you find, call me first. She told him she would. She meant it. She walked out into the gray Harwick morning with a crow-shaped key in her pocket and the particular feeling of a person who has just agreed to something they don't yet fully understand. The Greyhound to Ashford took 4 hours with a transfer in Lewisburg. Marin sat with her face against the window and watched Virginia become West Virginia. The landscape shifting gradually, the way mood shifts, not all at once, but through accumulated small changes, until you look up and realize the world you're in is not the world you started in. The suburbs thinned. The strip malls and franchise restaurants gave way to highway and farmland, then to hills, then to mountains, forested and dark and very old. The kind of mountains that make a person feel correctly small. She had her earbuds in, but nothing playing. She wanted the silence. She needed to think. She thought about her father. Robert Holloway had been a quiet man, but not a small one. There is a difference. Small men are quiet because they have nothing to say, or because they are afraid to say it. Her father was quiet the way deep water is quiet, not because there was nothing there, but because what was there didn't need to make noise to be present. You felt him in a room. You felt his attention when it landed on you, warm and specific, like a hand on your shoulder. He had told her stories about Ashford Mill, the way other fathers told stories about their own childhoods, with a reverence that was almost religious. The smell of fresh-cut pine, the sound of the saw in full operation, a sound he described as the loudest honest noise he had ever heard. The weight of a good piece of lumber, properly graded, stacked, and ready to become something. His father, Silas, teaching him to read the grain of the wood, the way some men learn to read weather, by instinct, by patience, by long practice. He never called the mill a failure, not once. When it closed, he talked about it the way a person talks about a chapter that has ended, with respect for what it was, without bitterness about what it could no longer be. And he had kept it 12 years, through his illness, through his marriage to Gloria, which Marin had never fully understood, and had learned not to examine too closely, because examining it produced feelings she didn't know what to do with. Through years of mounting debt and medical bills and the slow erosion of his physical strength, he had kept it because it was his father's, because it was hers. She pressed her palm flat against the cold glass of the window and looked at the mountains passing and tried to hold on to that, the specific weight of being chosen, of having something held in trust for you by someone who loved you. The bus pulled into Ashford at dusk. The town was smaller than she had imagined, which was saying something because she had imagined it small. One main street, 2 blocks long. A diner with a hand-painted sign. A hardware store. A post office the size of a large closet. 3 pickup trucks parked at angles along the curb. The casual geometry of a place where parking had never been a problem. The air that hit her when the bus doors opened was a physical thing, cold and clean and dense, with the smell of wood smoke and pine resin and the particular mineral freshness of mountain water nearby. She breathed it in, and something in her chest shifted some tight and guarded thing, relaxing incrementally, as if the air itself was a language she recognized but hadn't heard in a long time. She shouldered her backpack, picked up her cardboard box, and stepped off the bus onto the gravel shoulder of the road. The bus pulled away with a hydraulic sigh. She was alone under the buzzing yellow light of the single street lamp on the corner of Main, in a town she had never been to, in search of a building she had never seen, guided by a key shaped like a crow. She found the general store first, a low building with a porch, its windows warm with light. A bell above the door announced her arrival with a sound like a small, friendly argument. Behind the counter, a woman in her mid-60s looked up from a crossword puzzle. She had the kind of face that had been kind for so long, it had shaped itself permanently around that kindness, warm lines around the eyes, a mouth that seemed to rest at ease. She wore her gray hair in a practical braid and looked at Marin with the frank assessing attention of a woman who had seen enough of the world to read a person quickly. "Help you with something, honey?" "I'm looking for the old sawmill," Marin said. "Holloway property, out past the edge of town, I think." The woman's expression shifted. Something moved through it, recognition, and beneath the recognition, something that might have been emotion carefully managed. "Lord," she said softly. "You're Robert's girl." Marin went very still. "How did you know?" The woman came around the counter with the unhurried certainty of someone who has lived in the same place long enough to know where everything belongs and what everything means. She extended her hand. "Edna Creel. My husband Roy and I have had this store going on 31 years. She shook Marin's hand with a firm, dry grip. "Your father called Roy every few months right up until the end. Always the same questions. How's the town doing? How's the old mill looking? Is the road still passable in winter?" She paused, and her eyes were very direct. And always, always, he'd say the same thing before he hung up. He'd say, "My daughter's going to come up there one day. Make sure somebody looks out for her." The words hit Marin somewhere she hadn't braced for. She had spent 8 months being practical about her father's death. She had been practical at the funeral, practical through the will reading, practical through the long, silent winter of living in Gloria's house, counting down to 18. Practicality had been the thing that kept her functional, the scaffolding that held her upright while everything else fell. It held now, but just barely. "He knew," she said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of it for being steady. "He knew," Edna said simply. She gave Marin directions to the mill a mile past the edge of town. Follow the gravel road to the river, and pressed a paper bag into her hands containing a thermos of coffee and a wrapped ham sandwich, with the matter-of-fact generosity of a woman who has fed people in difficulty for decades and sees no particular reason to make a ceremony of it. "Roy's at home," she said. "Hardware store attached to the house around the corner. If you need anything, tools, supplies, whatever, bang on the door. Don't care what time it is." "Thank you," Marin said. "Don't thank me." Edna waved it off. "Your daddy was good to this town back in the day. Employed half these families at some point or another. Some debts don't expire." Marin walked out into the dark. The gravel road ran straight south for half a mile before bending east toward the river, flanked on both sides by pines so tall and dense that the sky above became a narrow seam of dark blue stars, visible only in that thin strip between the tree lines. Her footsteps crunched in the quiet. The river was audible before she could see it, a low, continuous sound, the voice of something patient and very old. She smelled the mill before she saw it. Old wood specifically. Not the clean, bright smell of freshly cut lumber, but its elder relative, the dense layered smell of timber that has weathered decades, absorbed rain and cold, and years of silence, and taken on the complexity of anything that has endured. Underneath it, machine oil, oxidized iron, the mineral smell of concrete. And then the trees thinned, and it was there. Ashford Mill. It was larger than she had expected. She realized, standing at the edge of the clearing, that she had built a version of it in her imagination, based on her father's stories, and that this version had been scaled to sentiment rather than reality. The real thing was enormous, a sprawling complex of connected structures anchored by a main building with a steeply peaked roof that rose against the dark sky like the prow of an old ship. The walls were weathered to the silver gray of driftwood. Several sections showed the patient work of time, and weatherboards warped and separated. A section of secondary roof collapsed inward, a sagging run of guttering hanging at an angle. A chain-link fence, rusted to the color of dried leaves, ringed the entire property. A gate at the front was secured with a thick chain and a heavy padlock. A sign hung from the gate, its reflective paint long since faded to near illegibility. Holloway and Son, lumber established 1971. Her grandfather's name on her grandfather's sign on her grandfather's gate, in front of her grandfather's mill that her father had kept for her through 12 years and one terminal illness. And what she was only now beginning to understand had been a great deal more. She stood there for a moment and let the full weight of it settle onto her. Then she reached into her jacket pocket and took out the iron key. The crow in flight. The bow was intricately worked, the feathers of the wings individually rendered in the iron, the beak slightly open as if mid-call. Someone had made this with care. Someone had thought about what it should look like. She tried it in the padlock. The mechanism was stiff, gummed with years of rust and disuse, and for one terrible moment, she thought it wouldn't turn, that this was where the story ended, on the wrong side of a fence, with a key that didn't fit. She leaned into it, put her shoulder behind it, both hands on the bow, torquing with everything she had. The lock surrendered with a sound like something torn. The chain fell. The gate swung inward on screaming hinges, years of silence compressed into that single sound. She stepped through onto the muddy track that had once run with the constant traffic of logging trucks. The main building's sliding doors were massive, designed for industrial access and padlocked shut. But beside them was a smaller door, a standard entry with a separate lock. She tried the iron key. It turned smoothly, as if it had been waiting. She pushed the door open. The dark inside was total, not the softened darkness of a room at night, with ambient light leaking under doors and around curtains, but the true, absolute darkness of a space that had been sealed from light for a very long time. The air that came out of it washed over her face in a wave, cool, dense, carrying that same layered smell amplified many times over. Old wood, old iron, old time. She took out her phone and switched on the flashlight. The beam cut into the darkness, and the mill opened up around her. The space was cathedral tall, the ceiling lost somewhere above, in a tangle of massive wooden beams and defunct steel framework. The floor was thick with a blanket of sawdust and decades of settled dust. The light caught motes in the air. They drifted and spun in the beam like microscopic stars, disturbed for the first time in years by the simple fact of her breath. She walked slowly, sweeping the light. The machines emerged from the dark, one by one, enormous and silent and strangely dignified. The head saw first a circular blade 5 feet in diameter, mounted in a cast iron frame so heavy it seemed to grow from the floor. Rust had coated the teeth in a fine red fur. Beside it, the log carriage on its rails designed to carry whole trees into the path of the blade. Farther in, a bank of secondary machines, edgers, trimmers, a wide belt conveyor. With a rotted rubber surface, the steel frame still perfectly intact. Everything was exactly as it had been left, as if the men who worked here had walked out one morning and never came back. Because they had. She found the stairs to the foreman's office, a short flight along the east wall, rising to a small enclosed room built on a platform overlooking the main floor. The door was slightly ajar. She pushed it open. The office was small and square, with a large window looking out over the machinery below, or what would be a view of the machinery when the lights were on. A simple desk, a single wooden chair, a bank of filing cabinets along the far wall, their faces dulled with dust. On the desk, the detritus of an interrupted working life, a few paper clips, a dried pen, a coffee mug with a faded logo. On the wall, a calendar. She crossed to it and held up her phone. June 2012. A photograph of a mountain lake, the water green and still. The month her father had walked out of this office for the last time. She had been 6 years old. She had been home in Harwick, probably playing in the backyard, completely unaware that her father was standing in this room, turning off these lights, locking this door, carrying something with him that he would spend the next 12 years quietly, carefully arranging to leave behind. She sat down in the wooden chair. It groaned under her weight, but held. She looked out the window at the dark shapes of the machines below. She thought about the phone call her father made to Roy Creel every few months. How's the mill? Is the road still passable? My daughter's going to come up there one day. She thought about the key shaped like a crow. She opened the top drawer of the desk. Empty. The second drawer, empty. The bottom right drawer, locked. She worked the tip of the iron key into the small keyhole. Leveraged, felt the mechanism resist, and then give, not a clean unlock, but a cracking of the frame. The drawer pulling free from its housing, the broken lock mechanism clattering to the floor. Inside the drawer against the back panel, a military-style ammunition box, olive drab metal, sealed with 2 heavy latches. She lifted it onto the desk. Her hands were not entirely steady. She released the latches, 2 sharp snapping sounds in the silence. She lifted the lid. No money, no maps, no obvious treasure. On top, a stack of cream-colored envelopes bound with a dried rubber band. Sealed. The topmost envelope had 2 words on its face written in her father's handwriting. The handwriting she had spent the past 8 months aching to see on ordinary things. Shopping lists, notes left on the counter, cards. For Marin. Below the letters, a small plastic cassette player, the kind she had only ever seen in old photographs. A cassette already loaded. A handwritten label on the tape. Play me first. She sat in her father's chair in her father's mill in the dark silence of 12 years of waiting and looked at the cassette player in her hands for a long moment. Her chest hurt in the specific way that grief hurts when it is joined by something else. Not joy exactly, but its close cousin. Something that feels like being found. She checked the batteries, still seated, uncorroded, as if he had thought about this too. She pressed play. The tape hissed. 1 second, 2, and then his voice filled the room, low, warm, slightly rough at the edges, the way it had been in his last years, the illness having taken something from its register, but unmistakably, entirely, completely him. Not a memory of his voice, not her reconstruction of it, which she had been working on anxiously for 8 months, afraid of the details she was already beginning to lose. His actual voice recorded and preserved, stepping out of the past and into this dark room like something that refuses to stay gone. Marin. She made a sound she had not planned to make. Her hand went over her mouth. Her eyes closed. She let him speak. "If you're hearing this," he said, "then a few things are true. You're 18. I'm gone, and you found this box. I'm sorry. I'm sorry for all of it, for not being there, for the way things ended, for what you probably had to go through to get to this room. You were always stronger than I had any right to hope for. But I'm still sorry." A pause. The quiet of the tape, the ambient silence of the room pressing in around his voice. "I need to tell you some things. Things I couldn't say while I was alive, because saying them would have put you in danger, and that was the one thing I could not allow." Another pause. "Gloria is not what she appears to be. She never was. Her brother Callum Marsh is a dangerous man. Not because he's violent, though I believe he could be if he needed to be. Dangerous because he is patient and calculating and has enough money to make the law do whatever he needs it to do." A breath. "He's been using land near the Greenbrier, near this property, for industrial waste disposal. Illegal dumping at a scale that would make your hair stand up. He needs this mill. Not for the wood, not for the land. He needs it because whoever owns this property controls the access point to the river. Without it, the evidence of what he's done is eventually going to surface. With it, he buries everything." The chair creaked as Marin shifted her weight. She was barely breathing, I found out. I started keeping records. The full story is in the letters, read them in order. But the records themselves, the proof, and something else, I want you to have a choice. I've put them somewhere safer than paper." A pause. "In the main hall, west wall, the big floor planer. Look underneath it. The concrete there is newer than the rest. I poured it myself 2 years ago." His voice steadied. "You'll know what to do. You always knew what to do, even when you didn't know you knew. That's something you got from your grandfather, not from me. I was always the one who needed more time. She could hear him breathing on the tape. She recognized the particular sound of him choosing his words with care. Trust Harlan Pruitt. He doesn't know everything. I kept him out of the most dangerous parts for his protection, but he's a good man, and he will fight for you. And Marin. A pause that was different from the others. Waited. Full. I am so proud of you. I have been proud of you since the day you arrived. You never needed me to be proud of you. You would have been exactly who you are regardless. But I want you to know it. I want that to be one of the last things I say to you. Another breath. Go find the planer, and then go do what I couldn't quite finish. The tape ran on for a few seconds, the soft, patient hiss of blank tape, and then clicked to its end. The silence that returned was not the same silence as before. Marin sat in her father's chair and let the tears come finally after a year of not letting them. They came without drama, without sound, simply as water comes, because the conditions were finally right, because there was nothing left to hold them back, because she was alone in her father's mill in the dark, and there was no one to be strong for. She let them run their course. Then she wiped her face with the back of her hand and stood up. She put the cassette player carefully back in the box. She picked up the letters and held them for a moment, feeling the weight of everything they contained. Everything he had thought to tell her. Everything he had wanted her to know. All of it compressed into these sealed envelopes bound with a drying rubber band. Not yet. First, the planer. She picked up her phone. The battery was at 11%. She walked back down the stairs across the silent main floor toward the west wall. She found the floor planer exactly where he had described it, a long, low machine of cast iron, the width of a small car, its cutting hood sealed and still. It crouched against the wall like a sleeping animal that had forgotten it was supposed to have a purpose. She got down on her hands and knees, shone her light into the narrow space beneath it, and looked. Most of the concrete was old, dark-stained, cracked by years of temperature change and the memory of heavy use. But in the center of the space under the planer, there was a section that was different. Lighter in color, smoother in texture. A rectangle approximately 3 feet by 4, sitting in the old concrete like a patch on worn clothing. Her father's hands had poured that concrete 2 years ago when he still had the strength to drive up here and do it. She pressed her palms against it. Solid. Of course it was. She crawled back out and stood up. Her phone screen dimmed suddenly, the battery warning icon appearing. She was out of light and almost out of time. She looked at the door, looked at the rectangle of pale concrete visible in the last of the flashlight beam. She needed tools, a sledgehammer, a pry bar, light. And then her phone went dark. The mill was absolutely black. The kind of dark that has texture that seems to press against your skin. She stood in it for a moment, very still, hearing her own breathing and the distant sound of the river and nothing else. She was not afraid. She was in fact the furthest she had ever been from afraid. She pocketed the dead phone and moved through the darkness by memory, one hand trailing along the cold iron skin of the silent machines, until she found the small door, pushed it open, and stepped out into the night. The air was cold and clean and full of pine. Above the trees, a narrow slice of sky held more stars than she was used to seeing. The kind of stars you forget exist when you live in a city so many. They made the sky feel crowded with attention. She locked the door with the crow key, looked at the building, looked at the stars. She walked back toward town. Roy Creel's hardware store was dark, but there was a light on above it in the apartment on the second floor. A handwritten sign below the regular hours notice. If you really need something after hours, knock loud. Don't be shy. She knocked loud. Roy appeared at the door in a flannel shirt and work pants, clearly not asleep. A man of the generation that keeps late hours and calls it thinking time. He was broad-shouldered, somewhere in his early 70s, with a white beard trimmed short, and hands that had spent a lifetime doing work that required them to be capable and trusted. He looked at her for exactly 1 second. "You're Robert's girl," he said, not a question. "Edna called you," Marin said. "Edna always calls me." He opened the door wider. "What do you need?" "A sledgehammer, a pry bar, work lights if you have them, and whatever you have that runs on batteries." He looked at her for a moment with an expression that combined respect and concern in equal measure. He had the eyes of a man who has watched the children of people he respected grow up and occasionally become their parents in ways that are not entirely comfortable to witness. "You finding what you expected out there?" he asked. "I'm finding things I didn't know to expect," she said, "which I think might be better." Roy Creel nodded slowly, as if this were a sensible thing. He pulled the door open all the way and stepped back to let her in. "Your father came to me once," he said, leading her through the dark store toward the back wall where the heavy tools hung. "About 2 years ago. Drove up here alone, middle of winter. Said he needed to borrow some equipment for a day. Said it was for work on the mill property. I lent it without asking questions because that's the kind of man he was. You didn't need to ask questions about him." He lifted a sledgehammer from its hook and handed it to her, assessing her grip, satisfied. "He brought everything back the next morning, cleaner than he borrowed it, which is not something everyone does." He handed her a pry bar, long and heavy, its steel worn smooth with use. He shook my hand before he left, held on a little longer than usual. A pause. I didn't know then that it was close to the last time I'd see him. Marin held the tools and said nothing because nothing needed to be said. "There have been some vehicles around the mill property lately," Roy said, moving to the work lights and selecting a battery-powered LED lantern and a headlamp. "SUVs, dark-colored, no local plates, men in clothes that don't belong in these mountains." He handed her the lights. I don't know what that means for certain, but I know what it feels like. It feels like someone waiting for something to be available, Marin said. That's exactly what it feels like. He met her eyes. You be careful out there, and I mean that in more ways than one. She paid him. He gave her change and walked her to the door. My wife told you Robert always said you'd come, Roy said at the threshold. She did. He was right. He put his hand briefly on her shoulder, a quick, fatherly gesture not overlong. He usually was about the things that mattered. She walked back toward the mill in the dark, the sledgehammer over her shoulder, the lantern swinging from her hand, the pry bar tucked under her arm, the weight of the tools, a different kind of weight from the weight she'd been carrying all day. More specific, more purposeful, more like equipment, and less like burden. The road was dark, and the pines pressed close, and somewhere to her right beyond the tree line, the Greenbrier River moved in the dark, the way it had moved for centuries, patient and indifferent, and full of things it had been asked to keep quiet. She was going to find out what those things were. She walked through the gate without slowing down across the muddy track and back to the small door. She unlocked it, stepped in, and set the lantern down on the floor. Its light spread slowly across the mill, a warm amber that reached the walls and the ceiling and filled the space with a quality of illumination that was different from the phone flashlight. Not a cutting beam, but a spreading warmth, a presence. The mill looked different in this light, less like a ruin, more like a place that had been holding its breath. She took the sledgehammer in both hands. She walked to the west wall. She was ready. She got down on her hands and knees and crawled under the planer. The space was tight, 2 feet of clearance between the machine's belly and the floor, crisscrossed with drive shafts and grease-caked gears that had not moved in over a decade. The smell under there was stronger, more concentrated machine oil and rust, and the particular mineral coldness of old concrete. She positioned the lantern at the edge of the opening where its light could reach her, then dragged the sledgehammer in after her, the head scraping against the concrete floor. The newer section was immediately visible in the lantern light. She had felt it with her hands before in the dark, and even then she had registered the difference. Now she could see it clearly, a rectangle of lighter concrete sitting in the darker surrounding floor, like a page inserted into an old book. The edges were neat. The surface was smooth. Her father had done good work. She raised the sledgehammer. The first swing was clumsy, the confined space not allowing for any real arc, and the head glanced off the concrete frame of the planer with a ringing clang that filled the entire mill and bounced off the high ceiling and came back down at her from every direction simultaneously. She flinched, repositioned, adjusted her grip lower on the handle. The second swing landed true. A dull, solid impact. A sound like a word being said in a language she was just beginning to learn. She swung again and again. The rhythm of it took over hoist, bring down, absorbed the impact, reset. Her arms began to burn from the shoulders down. Sweat ran into her eyes. The confined space made everything harder, and the body heat she was generating had nowhere to go, building up under the machine until she was working in her own private weather. She did not stop. 12 minutes in, she felt it, not heard. It felt it through the handle and into her palms. A change in the quality of the impact. A give where there had been only resistance. She dropped the sledgehammer, wiped her face, and pressed her fingertips to the surface. A crack. Then another spreading from the center, the way frost spreads across glass in the particular branching pattern of something structural giving way. She crawled out, grabbed the pry bar, crawled back in. She found the largest crack, drove the tip of the bar into it, and leaned. The bar bit. She felt resistance massive and stubborn, and she leaned harder, using her whole body pressing down with everything she had. There was a grinding sound of stone moving against stone, and then a chunk of concrete lifted and shifted, and she worked the bar under it and levered it up, and it broke free from the surrounding slab with a sound like a rifle shot. She cleared the pieces with her bare hands, ignoring the scrapes. Her knuckles were bleeding slightly. She didn't care. She broke the remaining sections apart, with the pry bar working methodically from the outside edges toward the center, until the bar struck something that was not concrete. A hollow metallic sound, clear and deliberate. The sound of something that was placed there on purpose. She cleared the last of the rubble with her hands. The lantern light reached into the hole and found the surface of a flat metal case, wider and longer than the ammunition box in the office. Its surface dull and unfinished, the military green of something designed for practicality rather than appearance. She found the handles on either side, got her fingers under them, and pulled. It was heavy, significantly heavier than she expected. She dragged it across the broken concrete, then out from under the planer, its bottom edge scraping against the floor. She straightened up, breathing hard, her arms aching and her hands raw. She set it in the middle of the floor in the lantern light. 4 latches, one on each side. She released them in sequence, each one releasing with a sharp, clean snap in the quiet. She put her fingers under the lid. She lifted it. The case was sealed with a rubber gasket, the kind designed to keep weather and moisture out, and it released with a soft hydraulic hiss, pressure equalizing, as if the case itself had been holding its breath. She looked inside. On top, stacked in tight, orderly bundles and wrapped in plastic sheeting, was money. More money than she had ever seen in one place, more money than she had thought her father capable of accumulating. She counted the bundles without picking them up. Each bundle was banded in increments of $5,000. She counted. She counted again. $218,000. She sat back on her heels. The lantern light lay steady and warm across the bills, indifferent to what it was illuminating the way light always is. She looked at the money for a long moment, and tried to understand what it meant, not what it was worth in practical terms, but what it meant about the man who had accumulated it. Robert Holloway, who had driven an 8-year-old truck for the last 6 years of his life because fixing it was cheaper than replacing it. Robert Holloway, who had taken his daughter to the movies exactly twice a year on her birthday and on Christmas, because those were the 2 days he decided were worth the ticket price. Robert Holloway, who had lived with Gloria's money and Gloria's taste and Gloria's careful management of his dwindling resources, and who had been building this quietly, privately, dollar by dollar in the only place on earth he was certain Gloria would never look. The worthless mill, the liability, the burden, the ruin. She reached into the case and carefully moved the money aside. Beneath it, wrapped in oilskin, was a book, leather-bound, dark brown, the cover worn smooth at the corners in the particular way of something handled often. And beside it, sealed in a clear waterproof sleeve, a portfolio of documents several inches thick. She lifted the book out first. It was heavier than a book that size should be because it was not a book in the ordinary sense. She opened it. Her father's handwriting filled every page, the neat, precise columns of a man who had been trained somewhere along the way in the discipline of careful record-keeping. But this was not the handwriting of someone recording the ordinary business of life. The columns had headers, date, location, quantity, transport, recipient, amount paid. And down the left margin of each page, cross-referenced in a code, she would need the letters to fully decode a series of initials. CM appeared on nearly every page. Callum Marsh. She set the ledger carefully on the floor beside her and opened the portfolio. The documents inside had been organized with the same methodical care as the ledger. On top was a sheaf of geological surveys, detailed maps of the land surrounding Ashford Mill, the river corridor, the watershed drainage patterns. Her father had annotated them in pencil marking specific locations along the Greenbriar's tributaries with small, careful X's. Beneath the surveys were laboratory reports, pages of them filled with the dense technical language of environmental chemistry, compound names she could not pronounce. Numerical values she could not interpret from memory alone, but flagged throughout in her father's hand with a single notation, E, P, A, limit, and then the measured value, and then a multiplier. She read 1. The EPA limit for trichloroethylene in waterway discharge was 5 parts per billion. The sample taken from the tributary marked Site 3 on the survey map measured 914 parts per billion. She turned to the next page. A different compound, a different site. The number was worse. She turned to the next, and the next. Her father had taken 11 samples from 7 different locations over the course of 8 months, working with a retired chemist named Dr. Waverly, whose signed laboratory certifications were attached to each report. The contamination was not random. It was not accidental industrial runoff of the kind that accumulates over years through carelessness and inattention. It was deliberate, systematic, and targeted a pattern of illegal disposal that had been going on based on the earliest dated samples for at least 6 years. The Greenbrier ran south from the Ashford property. It fed into the watershed that served 4 towns downstream. 14,000 people drank water drawn from that watershed. Marin sat on the cold floor of her grandfather's mill with her father's evidence spread around her in the lantern light, and she let the scale of it land on her without flinching. This was not a property dispute. This was not a family argument about money and inheritance and the ugly arithmetic of grief. This was something that had been happening to real people, people in Mill Haven and Cedar Fork and Dunbar and Southport people who turned on their taps every morning and filled their coffee makers and gave their children glasses of water with dinner for 6 years. Because Callum Marsh had decided that the cost of legal disposal was not worth paying, and that the mountains of West Virginia were far enough from anywhere that no one would notice. He had nearly been right. Her father had noticed. She looked at the ledger again, turned to the last completed page, the final entries dated 5 months before Robert Holloway died. The handwriting here was slightly different, slower, less certain, the hand of a man whose physical control was beginning to fail him. But the entries were complete, every column filled, every notation in place. He had been working on this until he could not hold the pen. She closed the ledger carefully. She put it back in the case. She replaced the portfolio. She looked at the money for a moment, and then she closed the lid and fastened all 4 latches. She sat on the floor of the mill in the amber lantern light, surrounded by the patient silence of 30 years of machinery, and she let herself feel what she felt. It was not quite anger, though anger was in it. It was not quite grief, though grief was in it too. It was something that encompassed both of those things and extended beyond them, a sense of the specific weight of what her father had carried alone through illness and pain, and the constant pressure of living in the same house as the people he was building a case against, knowing that if he moved too soon or said too much, everything he was building would be destroyed, along with his daughter's inheritance. He had carried it without complaint. He had carried it with the same quiet, unflinching steadiness he brought to everything he did. He had carried it all the way to the end. Now she was carrying it. She stood up, pressed her palms flat against the planer's cold iron flank for a moment, a steadying gesture, as if making contact with something her grandfather and father had touched 10,000 times before her. Then she took the letters from her jacket pocket and went back upstairs. She read them by lantern light, sitting in her father's chair at her father's desk. He had numbered them on the back of each envelope, small, neat numerals in the lower right corner. She opened the first. His voice was in the writing, the same way it had been in the tape, not performing emotion, not explaining itself, just present the way he had always been present. Direct and warm simultaneously, two qualities that most people believe are in tension, but that her father had always managed to hold together. The first letter was dated 3 years ago, 14 months before he died. He wrote about the diagnosis, the particular clinical language the doctors used, the strange way that precise terminology can make the enormous feel manageable for exactly as long as it takes to leave the doctor's office and sit alone in a parking lot. He wrote about sitting in that parking lot for 45 minutes before starting the car. He wrote about what he thought about during those 45 minutes, which was not himself. He thought about Marin. He thought about what would happen to her after. He had already been married to Gloria for 4 years at that point. He had already begun to understand in the slow, reluctant way of a man who trusts people genuinely and revises that trust only under the pressure of undeniable evidence what Gloria was and what she wasn't. He did not say this explicitly in the first letter. He was still being careful, still keeping certain things compartmentalized in case the letters were ever found by the wrong hands. But the worry was in the writing running beneath the surface of every line. He did not tell Marin about the diagnosis when it happened. He wrote about that choice, the difficulty of it, the reasoning behind it. He didn't want the last years to be about dying. He wanted them to be about living for both of them for as long as they could manage it. She folded the first letter slowly and set it aside. The second letter was dated 8 months later. The handwriting was the same, but the tone had changed sharper, more focused, the way pain sometimes makes people clearer rather than foggier when they no longer have the energy for anything that isn't essential. He had begun the investigation. He wrote about driving up to Ashford alone in the early spring, when the road was still muddy from snowmelt, and walking the property for the first time in years. He wrote about what it felt like to stand in the mill after so long, not devastation, which was what he expected, but recognition. The building knew him. He wrote that without apparent self-consciousness, as someone who understood that places carry memory in the same way that people do. He had walked the perimeter. He had gone down to the river. He had noticed the discoloration on the rocks in the tributary that ran along the south edge of the property, a staining that ran against the natural mineral palette of Appalachian waterways. He had noticed the smell. Not strong, not obvious, the kind of thing a person walking past would register as slightly wrong and then file away under the general category of industrial modernity and its unpleasant adjacencies. He had not filed it away. He had taken a sample in an empty water bottle he had in his truck. He had driven it to a friend from his college days, a man named Dr. Waverly, who had spent 30 years in environmental chemistry and was now retired and living in Lewisburg, and had, as it turned out, a very clear and immediate reaction to what the preliminary testing revealed. That phone call, he wrote about it, briefly sparing himself the details, had changed the nature of what he was doing. It was no longer curiosity. It was evidence collection. The third letter was the densest. It covered the 8 months of systematic sampling, the pattern that emerged across the 7 sites, the growing picture of what Marsh Capital had been doing and for how long. He wrote about Callum carefully, specifically, with the measured precision of someone who understood the difference between suspicion and documented fact, and was determined to deal only in the latter. He had cross-referenced the dumping locations against Marsh Capital's subsidiary companies, working backwards through corporate filings and county records. He had found the paper trail not ironclad. He wrote not sufficient on its own for criminal prosecution, but sufficient when combined with the chemical evidence to raise questions that demanded answers from regulators who had the investigative authority he lacked. He wrote about what he needed to make the case complete. The one thing he had not yet been able to obtain was direct documentary evidence of Callum's personal knowledge and direction of the operation, something that proved this wasn't simply a rogue contractor acting outside his employer's awareness, which was the standard corporate defense in environmental cases. He had not been able to get that evidence before he became too ill to continue. He wrote, "I'm sorry I couldn't finish it. I'm leaving you the foundation. The rest is yours." She had to stop reading for a moment. She looked out the window at the dark machinery below, barely visible in the lantern's reach. Her breath misted in the cold air of the office. She thought about a man in the late stages of cancer driving alone up mountain roads in early spring to take water samples from a poisoned river. Not because anyone asked him to, not because he had anything left to gain from it personally, because it was the right thing to do, and because he was the person who had noticed, and because she understood this about him with a completeness that hurt. He could not have lived with himself if he had noticed and done nothing. She folded the 3rd letter. She picked up the 4th. This one was shorter. The handwriting was the most changed, slower, the letters less certain, formed with visible effort. But the voice was entirely there, present and clear, and somehow even more himself, for the reduction of everything extraneous. He had found out near the end that Gloria knew. Not the full scope of what he was doing. He believed he had kept that hidden, but that he was investigating something connected to Callum. Gloria had become more watchful. She had begun managing his mail and his phone calls in ways she framed as care, and that were in fact surveillance. He had accelerated the work as a result. The money, he wrote briefly about this, almost as an aside, the way he spoke about things he was slightly embarrassed by, had been accumulated over years. He had been living on less than his income since before the illness, siphoning off modest amounts into an account Gloria didn't know about. He had not been sure when he started exactly what he was saving for. He understood now that he had been saving for Marin's survival. He wrote, "Take the fresh start if you need it. There is no shame in surviving. But if you can manage to fight, if there is any part of you that wants to see this finished, the ledger is the beginning. Pruitt will know what to do with it. And then, I love you, Marin. I have always been so proud of you. That's the last thing I'm going to say in these letters, because I want it to be the thing you hear most clearly." She held the 4th letter in her hands for a long time. Then she placed it carefully in the case on top of the ledger and the portfolio. She set the cassette player on top of the letters. She closed the lid and fastened the latches. She had not opened the fifth envelope. It was labeled in her father's hand, "When it's over." She understood from this that it was not yet time. She carried the case to the far corner of the office behind the bank of filing cabinets and tucked it out of sight. Then she sat back down at the desk and opened her phone. It had charged to 22% from the small backup battery she'd discovered in her backpack, and called Pruitt. He answered on the second ring. It was past midnight. "Marin." His voice was alert, which told her he had not been sleeping. "Are you at the mill?" "I'm here. I found the box. Both of them." She paused. "He left me a recording, letters, a ledger, lab reports. 2 years of documented evidence of illegal industrial waste disposal into the Greenbrier watershed." Silence on the other end. Not the silence of a man who didn't understand, the silence of a man who was rapidly understanding too much at once. "How detailed?" he asked. 11 samples, 7 sites, 8 months of collection certified by a Dr. Waverly in Lewisburg. The ledger has names, dates, locations, amounts paid. Callum Marsh's initials on nearly every page. Another silence, then very quietly. "Robert, you magnificent, stubborn man." "There's something else," Marin said. "He left money, cash, enough to cover the back taxes. More than enough." "How much more?" "Significantly more." She heard him exhale a long, measured breath, the exhalation of a man recalibrating. "All right, Marin, listen to me carefully. This changes the landscape entirely, but we have to be strategic. Don't move the evidence. Don't move the money. I need you to tell me exactly. Harlan." She kept her voice level. "There's a SUV parked 200 meters from the mill property. No lights. It's been there for at least 2 hours. Someone knows I'm here." The pause that followed was brief and precise. "Get away from the windows," he said. "I'm in the foreman's office on the 2nd level. The windows face the machinery floor." "All right, good." She could hear him moving, the sound of a chair, footsteps, the efficient sounds of a man shifting into action. "Here's what's happening on my end, and I need you to understand the timeline." His voice settled into the controlled, focused register she recognized from the one time she had watched him work from across a conference table 8 months ago, when he had quietly and methodically prevented Gloria's lawyer from doing something Marin hadn't fully understood, but had instinctively recognized as wrong. "I received an alert 40 minutes ago from a legal docket monitoring service I subscribe to. Marsh Capital has filed an emergency motion with the county court." Marin's jaw tightened. "For the mill? An emergency petition for property seizure based on unpaid tax liability and this is the language they chose, persistent abandonment constituting a public hazard." He paused. "The hearing is scheduled for 9 o'clock tomorrow morning." She looked at the window, the dark of the mill below, the darker dark beyond the walls. "They filed it tonight," she said. "The night I arrived. Yes. They knew I was coming." "Someone told them you were coming." Pruitt said carefully. Or someone told them you had arrived. I don't know which. I don't know how. Marin thought about Gloria standing in the doorway that morning. The precise arrangement of her expression. The way the manila envelope had been held out not reluctantly, not hastily, but with the measured timing of something that had been rehearsed. She thought about Edna Creel saying your father called Roy every few months. She thought about who else might have been listening to those calls. Who else might have been tracking when they stopped. It doesn't matter which, she said. What matters is the hearing. If we can't demonstrate that the property is not abandoned and that the tax liability can be satisfied, the court will grant the motion. Given the political relationships Marsh Capital maintains in this county, I have to assume the deck will not be stacked in our favor. A pause. Marin, to stop this, we need to pay the taxes in full before the hearing opens, and we need to present a credible notice of intent to maintain and rehabilitate the property. Both. If we have only one, they'll find a way around it. I can pay the taxes, she said. The full amount, cash. If you walk into a county courthouse at 9 in the morning with $43,000 in cash, there will be questions. Let them ask questions, Marin said. My father earned that money. He saved it legally and he left it to me, and I'm using it to pay a legal debt. Let them ask every question they want. A pause. You sound like him when you do that. I'm going to take that as a compliment. It was entirely intended as one. She heard him moving again, more purposeful now, coat being lifted, keys found. I'm leaving now. It's a 3-hour drive. I'll be there before 9. A pause. The evidence, the ledger, the reports, keep them with you. Don't leave them in the mill tonight. I understand. And Marin. His voice shifted slightly, less lawyer, more something older and more personal. Your father spent the last 2 years of his life building what you found tonight. He did it sick and alone and under constant pressure, and he did it without a single word of complaint to anyone, including me. A brief silence. You had the right father. She didn't trust herself to respond to that with words, so she didn't try. She said good night. She ended the call. She sat in the dark office for a while longer thinking. She thought about what Pruitt had said. Someone told them you were coming, or someone told them you had arrived. The filing was too precisely timed for coincidence. Emergency motions took preparation, took coordination, with court clerks and county officials who had to be persuaded or compensated to receive a filing after business hours. This had been prepared in advance and triggered on a specific signal. The signal was her. Which meant that from the moment Gloria had handed her that envelope, possibly from before that moment, possibly from the moment it became clear that Robert Holloway's daughter would turn 18 in March 2024, the timer had been running. She thought about her father's 4th letter. Gloria had begun managing his mail and phone calls near the end, framing it as care. She thought about what that management might have included, who might have been informed of which conversations might have been reported back to which brother. She picked up her phone and opened a search browser. She typed in Marsh Capital and looked at what came up. The company's public profile was what she would have expected from a regional development firm. A clean website. a portfolio of commercial and residential projects across 4 states. The kind of curated presentation designed to convey stability and civic-mindedness. Callum Marsh appeared on the About page in a photograph taken at what looked like a charitable gala, silver-haired and composed, wearing the particular expression of a man who has practiced looking trustworthy for long enough that it has become indistinguishable from the real thing. She looked at the photograph for a moment. She had seen him once at her father's funeral. He had come with Gloria standing slightly behind her, saying the correct things to the correct people in the correct order. He had shaken Marin's hand in the receiving line. His hand had been dry and cool, and his grip had been exactly the right pressure, not too firm, not too soft. The grip of a man who has thought about the impression his handshake makes. She had been 16 and numb with grief, and she had not thought anything about him at all. She thought about him now. She turned off the phone to conserve the battery. She went to the filing cabinets and retrieved the case from behind them. She opened it and took out the ledger and the portfolio and put them in her backpack against her back, where she would feel them if anyone tried to take the bag. She left the money in the case. She thought about where to put the case. Not in the office if someone entered the mill. The office was the obvious place to search. Not near the main doors. She took it back downstairs, carried it across the main floor in the lantern's light, and returned it to the hole beneath the planer. She couldn't replace the concrete, but she stacked the broken pieces back into the opening as best she could, covering the case until it was indistinguishable in the darkness from the general debris of the floor. Then she turned off the lantern and sat in the dark for a moment, listening. The mill was silent. The river moved outside, continuous and patient. Nothing else. She turned the lantern back on low and went back to the window. The SUV was still there. She could see it clearly now. Her eyes adjusted the rectangular shape of it, dark against the darker tree line, positioned at the bend in the road where it had a clean sightline to the mill gate. No interior lights. No movement that she could detect. Watching. Waiting. She went back to the desk and sat down and thought about what it meant to be watched by someone who thought they were watching a frightened teenager with no resources and no plan. She thought about what it meant to be that teenager and to have a backpack full of evidence and $43,000 in a hole in the floor, and a lawyer already in his car driving through the dark toward her, and the documented proof of 6 years of crimes that 14,000 people downstream had been living with in their water without knowing. She thought about her father sitting in this chair, in this room, looking out at those machines, carrying all of this alone. She thought about what she owed him. Not justice, exactly. Justice was a thing that happened in systems, and systems were imperfect and slow and subject to all the pressures that money and patience could bring to bear on them. What she owed him was simpler than justice and harder than justice. She owed him the finish. She pulled out her phone one more time. 19%. She sent Roy Creel a text. She had saved his number from the paper receipt he'd written it on when she bought the tools. The message was short. I need to leave the mill property without using the main road. Is there another way out? The reply came in 4 minutes. Old logging trail south end of the fence line. Gate's been unlocked for 20 years. Comes out behind the Pentecostal church on Mill Race Road. I'll leave the truck on the church side. Keys under the left rear wheel. She read it twice. She thought about Roy Creel driving out in the middle of the night without being asked why leaving his truck for a girl he had met 3 hours ago. Because her father had been the kind of man who left that kind of loyalty behind him, the way certain people leave warmth in rooms they have left. She put the phone away. She loaded her backpack. She took the lantern. She checked the door to the office, the staircase, the main floor below, listening, watching, finding only silence, and the patient dark. She moved toward the south end of the building. The old logging trail was overgrown, but navigable, barely wide enough for a vehicle, but sufficient for a person moving quickly and quietly, with a lantern held low. The tree canopy closed above her immediately, the stars disappearing, the world reducing itself to the small circle of amber light at her feet, and the sound of her own careful footsteps in the wet undergrowth. She walked for 10 minutes. The gate at the south end of the fence line was exactly as Roy had described the chain looped but not locked, the kind of security that had stopped being security so long ago. It had simply become habit. She pushed through it. The gravel lot behind the Pentecostal church was empty, except for one vehicle, an old Ford pickup, dark green, with a dent in the rear quarter panel and a bumper sticker from a county fair 7 years past. She went to the left rear wheel. The key was there. She sat in the truck for a moment before starting it, her backpack on the seat beside her, the lantern off the dark of the parking lot complete and quiet around her. She thought about the SUV parked outside the mill. Whoever was in it was still watching the gate, still waiting for movement, still operating on the assumption that they were in control of this situation, that she was trapped, that she was alone, that the girl who had inherited a worthless mill had no idea what she was sitting on. She started the engine. The truck turned over on the second try, reliable in the way of old things that have been cared for properly. She put it in drive and pulled out onto Mill Race Road, heading toward town. She had 4 hours before she needed to be at the courthouse. She had a backpack full of evidence and the knowledge of where the rest of it was hidden, and the bone-deep certainty that she was going to be there when it mattered. She drove through the dark mountain town with the heater running and the windows down a crack, the cold air coming in, keeping her awake and present. She passed the diner, closed now, its sign dark. She passed the hardware store. She passed the general store where Edna Creel had looked at her and said, "Your daddy was good to this town back in the day, and some debts don't expire." She drove to the end of Main Street and pulled over under the one working street lamp and sat in the truck with her hands on the wheel and let herself be still for a moment. She thought about the ledger, the 11 samples, the 14,000 people downstream drinking water from a poisoned watershed. She thought about her father in the last year of his life, driving up a muddy mountain road alone in early spring to take a water sample in a plastic bottle. She thought about what it means to finish something. Then she took the backpack off the passenger seat and pulled out the fourth letter, the last one she'd read, and she read the final paragraph again, the one she had memorized without meaning to. Take the fresh start if you need it. There is no shame in surviving. But if you can manage to fight, if there is any part of you that wants to see this finished, the ledger is the beginning. Pruitt will know what to do with it. She folded the letter. She put it back in the envelope. She put the envelope in the backpack. She looked out the windshield at the empty street. The stars were visible above the tree line at the end of town, the same stars she had seen from the mill gate 3 hours ago, closer to dawn now, but still present, still doing their patient work of shining into the dark. She thought about her father. She thought, I'm going to finish it. Not loudly, not with any particular drama. The thought arrived the way a key turns in a lock that has been waiting for the right key, with a clean, definitive click. And then the door was open, and there was only the question of walking through it. She put the truck in gear. She had 4 hours. She used them. The county courthouse opened its doors at 8:30. Marin was on the steps at 8:15, her backpack over one shoulder, her jacket zipped against the cold that still lived in the mountain air at this hour. The town of Ashford was waking around her in the slow, unhurried way of small places, a pickup pulling out of a gas station, a woman walking a dog along the opposite sidewalk, the diner's sign flickering on. The sky was the pale, washed-out blue of early morning after a clear night, the mountains visible on 3 sides, dark and enormous and indifferent to whatever was about to happen in the building behind her. Pruitt's car pulled into the lot at 8:22. He looked like a man who had driven 3 hours through the night without sleeping beforehand, which was exactly what he was. His suit was the same one he'd been wearing the day before, now slept in and slightly rumpled, but his bearing was intact, the particular uprightness of a man who had decided long ago that how he carried himself in difficult moments was a choice he made deliberately. He crossed the parking lot with his briefcase and his coffee cup and looked at her with eyes that were tired and very alert. "You all right?" he asked. "I'm fine." He looked at her for a moment, not the quick professional assessment of someone who needed to move on to the next item, but a real look, the look of a man checking something that mattered to him. Then he nodded. "The SUV. Still at the mill when I left. They were watching the main gate." She paused. "I used the South Trail." Something moved through his expression, surprise quickly followed by something that looked like satisfaction. Roy Creel. He made a sound that was almost a laugh. "Your father had good taste in people." He straightened his jacket. "All right, here's what we're walking into. The emergency motion was filed by Marsh Capital's Regional Council, a firm out of Charleston. Whitmore and Associates, 4 partners, significant county connections. They'll have at least 2 attorneys in that room, possibly Callum Marsh himself. He looked at the courthouse doors. Our job in the next hour is simple. We pay the taxes. We file the notice of intent. We don't argue. We don't elaborate. We don't give them anything to work with. We complete the transactions that make their motion legally void, and we walk out. He looked at her. Can you do that? I've been doing that all night, Marin said. He almost smiled. Indeed you have. They went inside. The county clerk's office was at the end of a first-floor hallway that smelled of floor wax and institutional coffee, and the particular dustiness of buildings that process a great deal of paper over a great many years. The clerk herself was a woman in her 50s, with reading glasses pushed up into her silver hair, and the composed, faintly skeptical expression of someone who has seen most of what people bring to government counters and has learned to reserve judgment until the paperwork is complete. She looked up when they entered. Help you. We're here to settle the outstanding tax liability on the Ashford Mill property, Pruitt said. His voice in a professional context had a quality she hadn't fully registered in his office. It occupied rooms differently, filled them with a kind of calm authority that was not aggressive, but was very present. Account number 4471-B Holloway Property, Greenbrier County. The clerk's fingers moved to her keyboard. She typed. She looked at her screen. She looked back at them, her expression shifting into something more careful. That property is the subject of an emergency hearing scheduled for 9 a.m. this morning, she said. Filed by Marsh Capital, Pruitt said. Yes, we're aware. We are paying the outstanding tax liability in full, which renders the grounds for that motion legally moot. If you'd pull up the account, you'll see the delinquent amount. A pause. The clerk looked at her screen again. $43,812. That's our understanding as well. Pruitt nodded to Marin. She unzipped her backpack. She had counted the money in Roy's truck alone in the parking lot behind the church in the small hours of the morning. She had wrapped the bills in a clean cloth she'd found in the truck's glove compartment and bound them with a rubber band from the case. She had counted them twice, then a third time, because her father had been meticulous, and she intended to be meticulous, and because the act of counting the physical reality of it had helped her stay present and grounded in the face of everything else. She put the bundle on the counter. The clerk looked at it. She looked at Marin. She looked at Pruitt. She removed her reading glasses from her hair and put them on. I'll need to count this, she said. Of course, Pruitt said. The counting took 11 minutes. The clerk counted once, then called a colleague from the back office, a younger man, who looked like he had been pulled from some other task. He was grateful to leave, and he counted again. Then the clerk counted a third time alone, quietly moving the bills in careful groups. During those 11 minutes, Marin stood at the counter and did not move. She kept her hands loose at her sides. She looked at a point above the clerk's head at the county seal mounted on the wall. The particular imagery of county seals. Everywhere. The mountains, the river, the agricultural motifs representing a version of this place that existed before anyone had decided to poison the watershed for profit. She heard footsteps behind her. She heard a door. She did not turn around. $43,812, the clerk said. She looked up, her expression now fully professional, all skepticism converted into procedure. Payment in full. We'd like a receipt, Pruitt said, stamped and dated with today's time. The clerk was already printing it. What, said a voice behind Marin, is going on here? It was not a question. It was the linguistic form of a question with the soul of a declaration. The voice of a man accustomed to rooms reorganizing themselves around his arrival. She turned. Callum Marsh was older than his photograph. Not dramatically, he was perhaps 60. The silver hair perfectly maintained the suit, a charcoal gray that had cost more than Roy Creel's truck. But the camera had been kind to him in ways that proximity was not. In person, there was something in the set of his jaw and the quality of his attention that photographs couldn't capture, a coldness that lived beneath the practiced warmth of his presentation, like a current beneath still water. Behind him stood two men in suits she didn't recognize, Whitmore and Associates, she assumed, and behind them, holding slightly back, a woman. Gloria. Marin had not expected Gloria. She processed this information in the fraction of a second available to her and filed it away without reaction, keeping her face still. Gloria was dressed as she always dressed, composed, appropriate, expensive, in a way that never called attention to itself. But something was different about her this morning. A tightness around the eyes, a quality in her posture that was not quite what it usually was. Marin looked at Callum Marsh. The taxes on the Ashford Mill property have been paid in full, she said. The clerk has the receipt. His eyes moved to the counter, to the clerk, to the stack of bills being processed into the county's system. A sequence of expressions crossed his face with the speed of whether surprise, then calculation, then the specific controlled blankness of a man deciding how to respond to something he had not planned for. Where did a girl your age get that kind of money? He said. His tone was the kind that is designed to diminish, not overtly hostile, but carrying within it the assumption that questions like this asked in this register produce shame and retreat in the person they're directed at. Marin let the question sit in the air for a moment, the way her father used to let things sit when he wasn't going to be rushed. My father left it to me, she said. Callum's jaw moved slightly. Robert Holloway was not a wealthy man. My father, Marin said, was exactly as wealthy as he chose to appear. She turned back to the counter. Pruitt was already at work, papers coming out of his briefcase forms being presented to the clerk. The notice of intent to rehabilitate and secure, being filed with a methodical efficiency that left no procedural gap for anyone to insert a delay. The clerk processed each document with the focused attention of a woman who understood that she was in the middle of something significant and intended to do her part correctly. One of the attorneys stepped forward and began to speak something about the timing of the filing, something about procedural irregularities. Pruitt responded without looking up from the counter. his voice pleasant and exact, citing 3 specific statutes and a county ordinance that addressed each objection with the precision of a man who had spent the previous 3 hours in his car reviewing exactly this contingency. Marin watched Callum Marsh. He was watching her. His attention was the kind that carries weight, not aggressive, not threatening in any way that could be named or acted upon, but present in the way of a man who was accustomed to watching people and understanding what he saw. She met his eyes and held them and did not look away. He was the first to look elsewhere. A small thing, but she felt it. Pruitt placed the stamped receipt in her hand. She folded it and put it in her jacket pocket.
"We appreciate your assistance,"
Pruitt said to the clerk. He picked up his briefcase. He put his hand lightly on Marin's elbow, not steering her, just present, and they walked toward the hallway. Behind them, she heard Callum Marsh say something to his attorneys in a low, controlled voice. She could not make out the words. She did not try. She and Pruitt walked out into the hallway and down to the building's front entrance and out into the morning air, and neither of them spoke until they had descended the courthouse steps and put 20 feet of open ground between themselves and the building. Then Pruitt exhaled a long, deliberate breath, the first fully unclenched breath she suspected that he'd managed in several hours. "Step 1, he said. "Step 1. She agreed. She looked back at the courthouse. Through the glass of the front doors, she could see movement in the lobby, one of the attorneys on a phone, the other speaking to the clerk. Callum Marsh was not visible, which was somehow more unsettling than if he had been. Gloria was standing near the far window. She appeared to be looking out at the parking lot, and Marin could not tell from this distance whether she was looking at anything in particular or simply standing the way a person stands when they have nowhere else to be. "What happens now?" Marin asked.
"Now,"
Pruitt said, opening his car door and setting his briefcase on the back seat.
"I make a phone call."
He straightened and looked at her over the roof of the car.
"Marsh Capital has their attorneys and their county relationships and their political capital. We have something better."
He paused.
"We have your father's ledger."
They sat in Pruitt's car in the courthouse parking lot, and he made the call. He called the senior partner at Whitmore and Associates directly. He had the number, which told Marin something about the preparedness with which he had approached this morning, and the conversation was brief, controlled, and devastating in its restraint. He did not threaten. He did not demand. He simply informed. He informed Whitmore's senior partner that his client, Marin Holloway, had come into possession of her late father's business records. Comprehensive records methodically maintained, covering a period of approximately 2 years, and documenting in specific detail a pattern of activity that he believed the relevant regulatory authorities would find extremely interesting. He further informed them that his client had not yet determined what to do with these records, and that this determination would be significantly influenced by the behavior of all interested parties in the coming days. He said good morning and ended the call. He sat quietly for a moment. Then he looked at Marin. Now we wait, he said. Not long. How long?
Long enough for that attorney to call Callum Marsh. Long enough for Callum Marsh to understand what we actually have.
He looked out the windshield.
These kinds of men, they're not stupid, Marin. That's important to remember. The worst thing we could do is assume we're dealing with someone who can be frightened by implications he doesn't understand. He'll understand immediately, which means what happens next will be calculated.
She thought about that. What will he calculate?
That his options have narrowed, Pruitt said. He can fight, which exposes him further and at greater cost than he anticipated. He can run, which is its own form of exposure and not really available to a man of his profile. Or he can negotiate. He looked at her. He'll negotiate.
And what do we want from the negotiation? Pruitt was quiet for a moment. This was the quality she had come to understand about him in the hours since she'd called from the mill. He didn't answer questions faster than he could answer them correctly. He gave each question the time it required.
That's not my determination to make, he said finally. Your father built this case. You found it and chose to use it. What you want from the resolution is yours to decide.
He looked at her steadily.
I can tell you what's legally achievable. I can tell you what the evidence supports. But what you're willing to accept, that's yours.
She looked out at the mountains above the tree line. She thought about 14,000 people downstream. She thought about her father in the parking lot after his diagnosis, sitting for 45 minutes, thinking not about himself, but about what he was leaving behind. She thought about the biased, patient work of the river moving downstream, always carrying what it carried the way water does, without choice, without knowledge of what it contained. The cleanup, she said. The river, whatever it takes to remediate what he's done. Callum Marsh funds it completely, not through one of his own subsidiaries, not in a way he can control or minimize. An independent environmental trust, third-party managed, funded at whatever level Dr. Waverley's reports indicate is necessary. She paused. And the mill stays mine. No sale, no development, no future claim. Pruitt nodded slowly, as if she had confirmed something he had already suspected.
That's achievable, he said, if the evidence is what you say it is.
It's what my father says it is, Marin said.
And he was a careful man.
The call from Whitmore and Associates came 2 hours later. They were sitting in the diner on Main Street. By then, Marin working through a plate of eggs and toast with the focused, practical appetite of someone who had been awake for 26 hours and required fuel rather than pleasure. Pruitt across from her with his third coffee and a yellow legal pad covered in notes. He answered, listened for 40 seconds, said he would pass along the proposal to his client and be in touch by end of day, and hung up. He set the phone down on the table.
500,000,
he said.
For the mill property, clean title transfer, all claims released.
Marin kept eating.
No.
Pruitt made a note on his legal pad.
I'll tell them.
The second call came 90 minutes later.
1.2 million,
Pruitt said.
Same terms.
Marin looked out the diner window at the main street of Ashford. at the town that had been here for 150 years, at the mountains that had been here for longer than human language had words for duration.
No, she said.
Pruitt made another note. She watched him write and thought about what it meant that the number had more than doubled in 90 minutes. It meant Callum Marsh was afraid. Not afraid of her specifically. She had no illusions about that. But afraid of what she held. Afraid of the specific, documented, certified evidence of what he had done. Afraid of the particular moment in American regulatory history when environmental crimes had begun to be treated as crimes rather than as the cost of doing business. Her father had understood that moment was coming. He had built his case for it. She thought about what Callum Marsh must be feeling right now in whatever room he was sitting in, surrounded by attorneys who were telling him what she held was real and actionable. She found she did not feel satisfaction about his fear. She felt something more neutral than that, the sensation of weight being distributed correctly of a balance that had been wrong for a long time, beginning to right itself. Her phone rang. She looked at the screen. Gloria. She looked at the number for a moment, the same number that had been in her contacts for years under a name she had changed at 14 from Mom to Gloria, because calling her Mom had begun to feel like a lie she was telling herself. And then she answered. Marin! Gloria's voice was not what she expected. It was not composed. It was not the practiced neutrality she had deployed every day of the 9 years she had spent in the Holloway house. It was the voice of a woman who was standing on ground that had just shifted and had not yet found her footing. Gloria, Marin said. A brief silence. I want you to know that Callum has... She stopped, started again. He told me this morning that his attorneys are withdrawing their indemnification of me from any civil liability connected to the property dispute, which means that if this goes forward, I am exposed. Another pause. He used me, Marin. I know that doesn't mean anything to you, and it shouldn't. I'm not asking for your sympathy. Marin waited. Your father knew, Gloria said. Near the end, he knew what I was. He never said it to me directly, but I could see it. He knew, and he chose not to confront it, because confronting it would have endangered you. A sound that might have been a breath or something less controlled. I didn't think he was capable of that kind of restraint. I underestimated him. Everyone did, Marin said. Yes. A pause. I have something. A recording, a conversation between Callum and 2 county officials from 18 months ago. It's on my phone. I recorded it without telling him. I didn't know then what I would do with it. I wasn't sure I'd ever do anything with it. Her voice steadied slightly. I'm sending it to your lawyer. Marin looked at Pruitt across the table. He had set down his pen and was watching her with complete attention. Why? She asked. Gloria was quiet for a moment. Because your father was a better person than anyone in his life deserved, and because whatever he built in that mill, he built it for you, and you came and got it, and you deserve to finish it. A pause. I'm not a good person, Marin. I'm not going to claim otherwise. But I'm not. I drew a line somewhere. I know where it is, even if I spent a long time pretending it was further than it is. The line, Marin thought. She thought about where lines get drawn and why, and what it costs to maintain them, and what it costs to cross them. Send it to Pruitt, she said. The call ended. She set the phone down on the table. Pruitt was already looking at his own phone, watching for the incoming file. That was Gloria, Marin said. I gathered. She has a recording. Callum and county officials 18 months ago.
Pruitt's phone buzzed. He opened the file. He put his reading glasses on and listened for 30 seconds with the phone pressed to his ear. His expression moving through several states in rapid sequence before settling into something that was very still and very intent. He lowered the phone. Well, he said, is it enough? Marin? He took his reading glasses off. It's a recording of Callum Marsh telling a county environmental officer that a complaint filed about discharge odors near the Greenbrier tributary had been, and I'm quoting, handled, and that there would be a deposit in the account they discussed at their previous meeting within the week. He set the phone down with precision, the deliberateness of someone handling something important. Combined with your father's ledger and the laboratory certifications, this is not a case for regulatory action. He paused. This is a criminal case. The diner was quiet around them. The morning rush had ended, and the lunch crowd had not yet arrived, and the waitress was somewhere in the back, and the cook could be heard moving in the kitchen, and through the window, the street was ordinary and calm and completely unaware. Then we don't negotiate, Marin said. Pruitt looked at her. We go to the EPA and the State Attorney General, she said. We give them everything. The ledger, the lab reports, the recording, all of it. If we do that, Pruitt said carefully, the negotiated settlement becomes much harder. Marsh will fight. He has resources. It will take time, possibly years. You won't see a cleanup fund or any financial restitution until the legal process has run its course, and that process will not be comfortable. I know. And you want to proceed. She looked out the window at the mountains. 14,000 people, she said, have been drinking that water. Pruitt held her gaze for a long moment. Then he picked up his phone. I'm going to need to make several calls, he said. What followed was not a single dramatic moment. It was a series of processes, each one unglamorous and procedural and necessary, the machinery of accountability doing what it does slowly and with considerable friction. The EPA regional office received the package, the ledger, the lab reports, Dr. Waverly's certifications, and the audio file by secure courier that afternoon. The State Attorney General's office received a duplicate. Pruitt handled the transmission with the meticulous care of a man who understood that how evidence is presented affects how it is received, and who intended to give this evidence every possible advantage. Marsh Capital's attorneys filed 3 separate motions in the following 48 hours, each one designed to delay, to challenge standing, to question the chain of custody of the evidence. Pruitt answered each one. He was not the largest firm or the most politically connected, but he was the most prepared, and preparation in legal contests is not the least important asset. On the 4th day, federal investigators appeared in Ashford. On the sixth day, Callum Marsh's personal attorneys contacted Pruitt directly. Not Whitmore and Associates, but a different firm one that specialized in criminal defense, which told its own story about how the situation had clarified in the minds of everyone involved. There were no more purchase offers. Gloria's cooperation with the investigation provided through her own attorney in exchange for considerations that were her business and not Marin's, added a dimension to the case that the evidence alone had not fully supplied the human testimony of someone who had been inside the operation, who knew where the bodies were buried in the figurative sense, which in legal proceedings is often as useful as knowing where they are buried in the literal one. Callum Marsh was indicted 11 weeks after Marin had walked into the Ashford mill with a crow-shaped key and a dead phone. The indictment covered 6 counts of illegal hazardous waste disposal, 2 counts of bribery of a public official, and 1 count of criminal conspiracy. His assets were frozen pending trial. Marsh Capital's operations were suspended. The environmental remediation of the Greenbrier watershed was ordered by the court as a condition of the asset. Freeze, a team of independent environmental engineers appointed by the EPA, began assessment work within 2 weeks of the indictment. The preliminary estimate for full remediation was 4 years, and a number that had many zeros. The frozen assets of Marsh Capital were more than sufficient. The 14,000 people downstream were notified. Their water was tested. Interim filtration measures were installed. It was not a clean or simple process. It was the kind of process that requires years and sustained attention, and the willingness to hold accountable those who would prefer to be left unaccountable. It had begun because a man named Robert Holloway had noticed a discoloration on some rocks in a tributary of the Greenbrier River on a cold day in early spring, and had chosen not to file it away. Marin drove Roy's truck back to the church parking lot and left it with the keys under the wheel and a note on the seat that said, "Thank you," in 2 words, because that was all the words that were right. She walked back to the mill. It was a different walk from the ones before it. Not the walk of a girl arriving at something frightening and unknown. Not the urgent, purposeful walk of someone moving through the dark to complete a task before dawn. This was a slower walk, a walk with room in it for looking around at the pines, at the way the morning light came through them in long, angled bars, at the river audible to her right, moving in its patient way over its stone. She unlocked the gate. She unlocked the small door. She stepped inside. The mill was the same as it had always been. The machines stood where they had always stood. The accumulated silence of 15 years still present in the air. The smell of old wood and iron still layered in every breath she took. The light came in through the high windows. Winter light, pale and clear, falling across the dusty floor in long rectangles. She stood in the center of the main floor and looked up. The ceiling rose above her, the massive beams of her grandfather's construction old-growth timber that had been standing here for 50 years, and showed every one of them in its surface the checks and grain of wood that had carried weight across decades.
The light moved through the dust she had disturbed with her entry. Small particles rising and settling in the columns of pale illumination. She had stood here before on her first night with a failing phone flashlight and no plan, and a cassette tape's worth of her father's voice still ringing in her chest. She had stood here and seen a ruin. She stood here now and saw something different. The same beams, the same machines, the same floor, the same windows, the same iron and wood and silence, but seen differently, the way the same landscape looks different, depending on whether you are moving through it in fear or in knowledge. She saw the space, the soaring height of it, the industrial bones of it built for endurance, built for the processing of raw material into something useful, built with the assumption of hard use and long duration. The waterfront position, the river audible through the south wall, the quality of light that came through the high windows at different hours, the particularity of the location tucked into the mountains, specific in the way that only old places are specific, carrying the memory of what they have been in every surface. Her grandfather had built this from nothing, had taken land and timber and iron and the labor of his own hands and his son's hands and the hands of the men who had worked alongside them, and had made something that lasted 50 years and was still standing. Her father had kept it through everything. Now it was hers, truly hers, free and clear, the tax receipt in her pocket, the deed in her name, no claims against it, no liens, no legal shadows. Just the building, the land, the river, and whatever she decided to do next. She heard footsteps outside, then a knock on the small door, practical and unhesitating, the knock of someone who has knocked on a lot of doors in a long life. "Come in," she called. The door opened and Clem Bassett stepped inside. He was in his mid-70s, lean and deliberate in his movements, with hands that were his most prominent feature. Large, scarred, roughened by decades of working with materials that left their mark on the people who worked with them. He wore a canvas work jacket and boots that had been resoled at least twice. He looked at the mill the way a person looks at a place they know very well and have not seen for a long time, not with surprise at what has changed, but with attention to what hasn't. Edna had called him, or Roy. He hadn't said which when he'd appeared at the diner the previous day, and introduced himself and sat down and said he understood she might need someone who knew the building. He walked slowly through the main floor, his hand trailing along the machines, the way her father's hand had trailed along them, she imagined, on the day he'd come back after years away. He stopped at the head saw and looked at it for a long moment. "Your grandfather bought this blade second-hand from a mill in Roanoke," he said. "1974. Drove down and back in a day to pick it up. I rode with him." He looked at the circular teeth furred with rust. He was so pleased with himself about the price he paid that he talked about it for 3 years. A pause. "Your father used to tease him about it." Marin watched him. When did you last work here?
Last day of operations, June 12th, 2009.
He said the date without hesitation, the way people say dates that have organized their memory of a period of their life. Your father kept us on longer than he could really afford to, because he didn't want to let people go without giving them time to find something else. Classic Robert. He moved on to the planer stopped when he saw the broken concrete, the shifted debris. He looked at it without comment, his expression unreadable. Then he looked at her. You found what he left you. It wasn't a question. I found it, she said. He nodded, as if this were the expected outcome, as if he had never really doubted it, having known Robert Holloway, having understood that men who kept things for a reason generally did so correctly. He walked the full perimeter of the main floor, assessing with the unhurried thoroughness of a man who has been doing structural evaluation for 50 years and does it as naturally as breathing. He looked at the beams, the foundation walls, the secondary roof where it had collapsed the floor surface. He checked the load-bearing columns with his hands, applying pressure, feeling for give. He looked at the plumbing rough-ins, the electrical conduit obsolete, but a roadmap for what had existed and what could be returned. He came back to where she was standing in the middle of the floor.
The bones are good, he said. Better than good. Your grandfather built this to last, and it has.
He looked up at the ceiling.
The secondary structure needs to come down and be rebuilt. The collapsed section took some of the wall with it, and there's been water intrusion that's compromised the framing. The main building is sound, foundations clean. The floor will need to be refinished, maybe replaced in sections. The mechanicals are a full gut and restart. He paused. But the building itself is worth saving. That's the question you always ask first. And the answer here is yeah.
What would you do with it? She asked. He considered this with the seriousness the question deserved. He looked around the space, the high ceiling, the river-facing wall, the windows, the scale of it.
Not a mill,
he said.
The economics don't work, and the world doesn't need it.
But this space... He turned slowly.
These ceilings, this floor, the light, the location.
He stopped turning.
I've seen spaces like this become things. In other places, other towns, workshops, craft studios, a market hall. A place where people come to make things and sell things and be in community.
He looked at her.
The town could use it. These mountains could use it. There's not much left in Ashford that brings people together. There used to be this place, used to be that in its way. People worked here. Their families waited for them here. It was the center of something. He paused. That's not the machinery's doing. That's the building's doing. The machinery was just the excuse for the building. She thought about that. The building as the real thing. The machines as the reason to have the building, not the building's purpose. She thought about what her father had said on the tape, not as a mill, but as something else. She had not fully understood then. She understood now. I don't know how to build anything,
she said. Clem Bassett looked at her with the patient expression of a man who has taught a great many people a great many things and has long since made peace with the fact that no one is born knowing.
"Your grandfather didn't know how to run a sawmill when he started," he said. "He learned it. Your father didn't know how to keep a business alive when the industry was dying around it. He learned it too for as long as he could." He held her gaze. "You'll learn what you need to learn. The question isn't whether you know how. The question is whether you want to."
She looked up at the ceiling, at the beams that had been here since 1971, that had stood through everything, that were standing still. "I want to," she said. Clem nodded once with finality, the nod of a man making a decision. "Then we start with the roof." She went back upstairs to the foreman's office in the late afternoon when the light was beginning to soften and the shadows of the machines below were growing long and complicated. She sat in her father's chair. She had cleaned the desk that morning, brushed away the decades of dust, cleared the desiccated detritus of the last working day, wiped the surface down with a cloth until the wood was visible again, the grain of it, the marks of use. The window was clean too. She had found a rag and a bottle of water and had cleaned it without planning to, simply because it needed cleaning and she was there. The view through it now was the view her father had looked at when this was a working mill, the main floor below the machinery arranged in the logic of its operation. Each machine connected to the next in the sequence that transformed raw timber into finished lumber. The sequence was broken now, the machines out of service, but the arrangement was still there. The spatial logic of it, the story of how things moved through this space when it was alive. She understood now, looking at it, why he had kept the photograph of the mountain lake and not replaced it with something of his own when he had closed up. He had left the office as it was on the last working day. Everything in its place. The calendar at the last month, the coffee mug where he'd set it because he intended to come back. He had always intended to come back. And when coming back himself was no longer possible, he had intended for someone else to come back in his place. She reached into her backpack and took out the 5th envelope. "When it's over." The paper was the same cream color as the others, slightly worn at the edges from the time it had spent in the case. Her name on the front in his handwriting. The same handwriting she had been aching to see for 8 months on ordinary things, and that she had now seen on letters that were far from ordinary. She opened it carefully. The letter inside was the longest. The handwriting was his final handwriting, the slower, more deliberate hand of his last months. The letters formed with evident effort, but the lines straight and the words clear, the discipline of his attention intact, even when his physical control was failing him. He began as he had begun the others without preamble. He wrote that he was proud of her. He wrote it at the beginning and at the end and once more in the middle because he wanted to be sure she heard it. Not proud of what she had accomplished specifically, though he was that too, but proud of who she was of the person she had been before any of this. The person who would have been worth being proud of, regardless of what she chose to do or not do with what he had left her. He wrote about the mill. He wrote about what it had been to him, not the business, but the place. The particular quality of light through those high windows on a winter afternoon. The smell of fresh-cut pine that no other smell in the world was quite like. The sound of the saw at full operation, which he had described on the tape as the loudest honest noise he'd ever heard, and which he described again here in writing, because he wanted her to have it in more than one form. He wrote about his father Silas, who had built this place from a cleared patch of mountain and a second-hand blade from Roanoke, and 50 years of daily work. He wrote about what it was to watch a man you loved do something with complete commitment, to see the fullness of a person expressed through their work, the way some people are most entirely themselves in the act of making something. He wrote, "I tried to carry what he built. I kept it for as long as I could. Now it's yours, truly yours, with no conditions and no expectations. Build anything you want with it. Build nothing. Let it stand as a monument to stubbornness, if that's what feels right. The land is yours. The building is yours. The history is yours. But I hope you build something." Not because the mill needs saving, not for my sake or for Silas's sake, but because I have watched you your entire life, and I know something about you that you may not fully know about yourself yet, that you are at your core a builder. You have always been the person who, when something was broken, wanted to understand how it worked before deciding whether to fix it. You have always been the person who thought in terms of what a thing could become rather than what it had failed to be. That is not a common quality. It is worth more than money. It is worth more than property. It is worth more than anything I could have left you in a conventional will. The mill at Crow Hollow is full of old machines that don't work anymore. But it also has a foundation that has held for 50 years and walls that have stood through every winter this mountain has had, and beams that my father cut and raised with his own hands. It has the river outside and the mountains around it and the light that comes through those windows in a way I have never seen in any other building. That's enough to start with. It's more than enough." He ended with the same words he had used on the tape, the words she had been carrying since she'd first heard them in this room on a cold night alone and 18 years old. "Go build something wonderful." And then, below the signature, one more line, smaller than the rest, added perhaps as an afterthought, or perhaps as the thing he most wanted her to find at the end. "I love you, Marin." The crow carries it home. She sat with the letter in her hands for a long time. The light through the clean window changed as the afternoon moved toward evening, shifting from pale winter white to something warmer, amber-edged, the light that comes just before a clear mountain sunset.
when the sky is not spectacular, but simply beautiful, in the way that ordinary things are beautiful when you are paying attention.
Below her, the machines sat in the gathering dusk. The head saw, the carriage and its rails, the planer against the west wall, its concrete patched and broken now, the case it had hidden recovered, and its contents dispersed to the purposes they were meant for. The conveyors and trimmers and edgers, the whole silent complexity of a system designed to take something raw and make it useful. She looked at it all and thought about what Clem had said. Not the machinery, the building. The machinery was the excuse for the building. She thought about what this space could hold. Not what it had held, but what it could. The possibilities that lived in the specific combination of its proportions and its light and its location and its history. She had been in enough places in her 18 years to know that not all spaces were like this one. Most rooms were rooms. This was something else. A space with a quality of accommodation in it, a willingness to contain whatever was brought to it with full seriousness and full presence. Her grandfather had brought lumber to it. She would bring something else. She folded her father's last letter and held it for a moment, the weight of it, the specific folded rectangle of paper, and then she placed it carefully in the inside pocket of her jacket against her chest. She stood up from the chair. She walked to the window and looked out at the main floor below, and it was not a ruin she was looking at. It was not a failure or a monument or a burden. It was a beginning. Clem was going to come back in the morning. Roy and Edna Creel would find ways to be useful because that was who they were and who they had decided to be in relation to this place and to the daughter of the man they had known. Pruitt would drive up on weekends sometimes because he was that kind of friend and because he had been her father's friend, and some friendships extend beyond the person who initiated them. She was going to learn what she needed to learn. She was going to make mistakes and correct them and make different mistakes and learn from those too. She was going to spend money in ways that were probably not optimal and make decisions she would look back on with the specific embarrassment of a person who did something for the first time and only understood how to do it after it was done. She was going to have days when the scale of it was too much and days when the scale of it was exactly right. She was going to build something, not because her father had asked her to exactly, not because of obligation or inheritance or any sense that this was required of her by the people and the history that had brought her to this room, but because she had stood in this space on a cold March night with nothing but a crow-shaped key and her father's voice on a tape, and she had felt what the space was, what it could hold, what it was asking to become. And that feeling had not left her, and she trusted it. She turned off the lantern. She walked down the stairs and across the main floor in the last of the evening light coming through the high windows, her footsteps quiet in the settled dust.
her hand trailing for a moment along the cold iron of the head saw, the blade her grandfather had driven to Roanoke to buy in 1974 that her father had told her about, that had been standing here in the dark for 15 years, waiting. She pushed open the small door. The air outside was cold and clean and full of pine. The sky above the trees was the particular deep blue of early mountain evening. Not dark yet, but committed to becoming dark, moving through its gradations with the patience of something that has done this every day for longer than anyone can account for. She locked the door with the crow key. She stood in the clearing for a moment, looking at the building, at its dimensions against the sky, at the peaked roofline and the weathered walls and the gaping section where the secondary structure had failed, at what was broken and what was not, and at the considerable extent of what was not. The river moved behind the trees to the south, continuous and present, carrying its water downstream toward the towns where 14,000 people lived and were beginning slowly and with appropriate caution to understand that the water they drank was going to be safe again. Her father had started that, had finished as much of it as he could. She had finished the rest. Now there was other work. She put the crow key in her jacket pocket next to the letter. She walked toward the gate and through it and down the gravel road toward the lights of the town, and the mountains held their positions around her, and the river kept moving, and the stars came out one by one above the pines, cold and clear and patient, doing what they had always done, shining into the dark, because that was their nature, and they had no intention of stopping.